Hello everyone, welcome to this last lecture on climate change. I have a bit of a cold, but I'll try not to cough in the microphone for you. So for this last lecture, I want to talk about the policies around climate change. Because we've talked about the science of climate change and the data that can be collected, about analyzing that data and using trend lines. And then in the previous lecture I talked about benefit-cost analysis and the importance of discounting to help make decisions about whether to take climate change actions. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. What type of actions can we take to reduce climate change? Mitigation and adaptation. And I'll also talk about the policies that have been in place in Australia regarding climate change. Now, let's start with the very first policy that was ratified in, I think it was 1997, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This UN Convention is the first step towards the Kyoto Protocol, which was ultimately ratified by 197 countries. It's nearly all countries in the world. This Kyoto Protocol took a long time to negotiate and finally decided that we need to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. This was a major recognition that climate change is dangerous to humans and that we need to, if not reduce, at least stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we'll see how that worked out during this lecture. So let's start with what we can do. The science has been showing us that yes, climate change is definitely an issue and we should take actions to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that goes into the atmosphere, or at least protect ourselves from global warming. Now, this is where politics comes into play. Should we take action? Think about that decision-making framework that I showed you last time. Because there's still too many politicians who think that taking action is too expensive and that the global warming is still debatable. Now, there's two things we can do. The first one is called mitigation, which is abating climate change by reducing emissions, for example, by charging more for pollution or finding alternative ways to produce energy or alternative ways to live, alternative production. But if you've been alive for the past 10 years, you may remember the whole debate here in Australia about charging for polluting activities. Another climate change abatement is called adaptation, which is adapting to a climate that's already changing and protecting ourselves from the negative impacts of climate change. Again, there's still political debate around this whole climate change issue. Hopefully by now I've convinced you that there shouldn't be a debate. The only debate should be about what are we going to do about it. So let me explain to you those two different types of actions, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation are actions to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases or to increase the storage of carbon in trees or soils. So what are possible mitigation actions? Most of you have probably heard about carbon pricing. Australia implemented this in July 2011, but then scrapped it again in 2013. Some people called that a carbon tax, but it essentially means that you have to pay a price on emissions of CO2. Another way mitigation activity is called carbon sequestration. This is storing carbon in vegetation and soils. So when vegetation grows, it takes up carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in its plants and the trees. So if you buy, for example, a carbon offset when you go flying, and tick that box, offset my carbon emissions, usually they buy trees. A third mitigation activity is alternative energy sources. Energy sources that have lower CO2 emissions. For example, wind energy, solar energy. But also funding research into less carbon intensive lifestyles is a mitigation activity. Finally, livestock, sheep, cows, etc. are a major contributor to greenhouse gases because they burp out methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So we at UWA we're studying ways to reduce those methane emissions from livestock, for example by feeding them different fodder. Now, mitigation is about reducing emissions. The thing with emissions is that they are emitted into the global atmosphere. They affect the whole world. So one country affects the world. That's why mitigation requires coordinated activities with all countries in the world. These are international steps that are taken. They're top down from high-level bodies to countries, to people in those countries. And they're the big climate change conventions that you may have heard about. The Kyoto, Copenhagen, Doha. Last year, the convention was in Marrakesh. And the Kyoto Protocol was the first and main international effort to coordinate climate change action. It was conceived in 1997 and ratified now by 197 countries. The objective I already mentioned, but they committed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to 5% of their 1919 emissions by 2012. Australia took 10 years to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, as a side note, and is still not on track to actually meeting that target. Now the thing is, Kyoto Protocol focused specifically on industrialized countries, so Western countries, because industrialization has been responsible for the main increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But it only had a commitment period until 2012. And we needed new international conventions and new agreements to cover the period after that, which took several years. So you may have heard of the Copenhagen Agreement, which actually didn't reach agreement, so that was a failed convention. But in 2015 in Paris, the UN reached an agreement, and it's now ratified by 160 countries. And last year, well, when I'm recording this, it entered into force on the 4th of November 2016. The objective of that Paris Agreement was to keep the increase of temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we now go from not stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations to actually the effect of climate change, reducing temperature increase. So the 2015 agreement was an historical agreement that entered into force on the 4th of November 2016. And in 2016, the next conference was in Marrakesh. Some of our colleagues here at the School of Agriculture and Environment attended that conference. And in 2017, the conference is in November in Bonn in Germany. I'll leave it at that for now and come back after the break to talk about adaptation.